Alex, I've been exposed to a lot of different behavior profiles, DISC, TRACOM social styles, Myers-Briggs type indicator.
Mm-hmm.
Explain to me, what are interaction styles? What specifically is the model?
Well, the model gets into focusing on behavior. And unlike the Myers-Briggs, which is not necessarily about behavior, but about some preferences and thought patterns, what we've done with the interaction styles is the only thing that we can observe is what people do, what their actions are. And so the history behind interaction styles as well as social styles in DISC is they focused on that there are predictable patterns of behavior. And so that's what interaction styles starts to plug into, is through observation there are certain things that people do that if you understand what those patterns are, then they become predictable.
So it's something I can actually see.
Yes.
All right.
And it doesn't really get into why people do these things, they just do them.
Okay.
So there's no judgment or evaluation around them.
All right.
And so what we find is people tend to be more open and interested in that kind of information.
Okay.
So it's just feedback.
All right. So it sounds like the important thing for me to know is that it's based on observable behaviors.
Yes, and they're
Okay.
predictable.
And predictable. Okay.
Mhm. Now, what we do in interaction styles is we actually break these behaviors down into categories. And we refer to that on a number of pieces where we talk about patterns of behavior.
Okay.
Such things as the volume of someone's voice, that they're loud or they're quiet, how quickly they talk, are they faster or slower. So things that could easily be seen or heard when you're working with someone.
Okay.
Now, what we do is we take these behaviors and then we put them on 2 dimensions. And so we actually form a model, which is 4 squares.
Okay.
And the first dimension we call the action dimension. And specifically, it's whether people perceive us as being more tell-oriented or more ask-oriented.
So when I think of action, I think of doing.
Yeah, and specifically the action orientation is around getting your needs met.
Okay.
So some people get their needs met by simply saying, I need you to do this now.
Okay.
And other people would simply do the same thing, but they would ask, could you do this for me now?
Okay.
So both of those statements accomplish the same goal, which is to get what you want. So that's the action orientation, and there's a whole set of behaviors around how people get those needs met.
Okay.
The second dimension is we call emotion orientation, and specifically it's how people express their feelings and their emotions when they communicate with other people. And what we find is that some people tend to be more controlled in terms of their body language and in terms of their vocabulary when they refer to their feelings. So you don't really notice or hear much reaction or much to do about emotions or feelings. The other extent is there are people that they constantly relate to others in terms of how they feel, what they think, what some of their emotions are. And they not only talk about them, but they also act. It's easy to see them on their face or in their body language. So there's a whole set of behaviors around that.
So it's the amount of emotion that I have.
Yes, now everybody has emotions and feelings. The difference is to what extent you demonstrate or that you share them with other people.
Okay, so again, the observable piece of it.
Exactly.
All right.
So both dimensions, the action orientation, which is about do you advocate, do you tell people what you want, or do you inquire, which is to ask. We have a shorthand that we refer to. People who are left of the line tend to ask or inquire, and people right of the line tend to advocate.
Okay.
So there's a whole set of behaviors that have to do with how we get what we need.
What sort of things?
And this is something I had referred to: volume of speech,
Okay.
pacing, how you express your opinions, how frequently or how
Okay.
infrequently, your body posture, how you carry yourself, your gestures, and the amount of eye contact that you give to people.
Okay.
So
So
based
those
on
are all action orientation.
exactly, those are
All right.
things that can easily be seen or
Okay.
heard. The emotion orientation, when we refer to that, we talk about above the line and below the line.
Okay.
When we talk about above the line, we're referring to people that tend to show their emotions and feelings very easily. And people below the line tend to be more reserved. They don't show or talk about their feelings.
So it might be harder for me to guess what's going on with them.
Exactly.
All right.
And specific behaviors that go with that tend to be the facial expressions. People below the line, which would be more conservative, tend to show very few facial expressions. People above the line tend to be very animated.
Okay.
So in addition to that, how people use their hands in their body, their orientations, are they more people-oriented, which would be feelings above the line, or are they more task, work, detail, information-oriented below the line? Pace of delivery, it's either very even below the line, or it would be a lot of variation, which would be considered above the line, more emotive. We also look at the inflection in their voice and how they describe things, their initial orientation to feelings or facts.
Wow. Would I have to remember all of these things in order to use this? It seems like a lot.
Well, it is a lot, and at the same time, there's some shorthand.
Okay.
For example, when I look at how action-oriented someone is, usually I listen to the volume of their voice and their pacing. Those are two signs that would indicate to me they're probably more advocate-oriented if it's fast and it's loud. If it's soft and it's slow, it's more inquire.
So I could hone in on or really focus in on a couple of these when I'm trying to sort out
Yes.
somebody else's style.
Exactly, and that's
Right.
what I do, is I try to get an initial reaction. In terms of emotiveness, if I see a lot of facial expressions and a lot of body language, a lot of movement, the person's generally above the line or
Okay.
emotive.
Okay.
If there's very few facial expressions and there's little movement, then chances are they're more reserved or below the line on the emotion orientation.
All right, that makes sense.
Now, what we do is as we go through the program, we now label what those 4 quadrants are. Because for each combination of action and emotive orientation, there's variations.
Okay.
So in the course, we refer to interaction styles. And starting in the upper left-hand corner, people that tend to be more inquire, which the behavior would be softer, slower, and more emotive, which would be more facial expressions, more feeling orientation. We call that particular style relator.
Relator. All right.
Okay, so how they relate to other people. If I stay above the line on the emotive side, but I simply increase the action orientation, which is people being more advocate oriented, then I get a combination of behaviors that is more expressor. So
Okay.
these are people who tend to be louder, faster, and very descriptive when it comes to expressing feelings and
Okay.
emotions. Now, if I drop to the bottom right-hand side of the quadrant, then I get a combination of people who are very advocate, loud, fast, and very reserved. So not a lot of emotion, more physically controlled. They're called a director.
Okay.
And if I continued with this reserved, emotive orientation, and I go to people who are more inquire, then they would be slower speaking, softer, and more physically reserved, more conservative, then that's an analyzer.
So 4 main styles then, 2 that are above the line, 2 that are below.
Exactly.
All right.
Now, generally, what we do at this point is people are very interested to know, well,
Yeah, I want to
what
know
am
where
I?
do I fall?
Exactly. So as part of the design, you'll notice that we try to include some activities in here
Okay.
where we actually will create this matrix on the floor in the classroom. And we have people, as we introduce action orientation and emotive orientation, to place themselves on the spectrum.
So physically stand where they think they'd be.
Yeah, and this is great because it gets people up, it gets them more involved, and it's not just lecture.
Okay, great.
The other thing that we do is then we add in a self-assessment. So people actually get a chance to go through all the behaviors and place themselves on this matrix.
Okay. Are there one of the concerns that arises for me as you talk about this is many of the people who are in my programs come from different cultures, different backgrounds.
Right.
It's really a small world in the classroom. Does this model work in different cultures? Would I still see 4 main areas, 2 axes of action orientation and emotion?
So how would this model vary when you go from one culture to another?
Yeah.
Well, actually, what's very interesting about this is all people have needs.
That's
So
true.
regardless of the culture, they all have to get what they want. So they're either going to do it more as an advocate or more with inquiry. So that's pretty standard. All people in all cultures have feelings and emotions. Now, the role that culture plays is it becomes a modifier to what extreme will people go to advocate or to inquire to get their needs met. So what happens is, from culture to culture, these 2 dimensions exist, but they shift in terms of the span of action or behavior that individuals would be engaged in.
So I might expect that in the U.S., an expressor would appear much more expressive, would show a lot more facial expressions than perhaps in Asia.
Exactly.
Still the same style, but it might look different.
Well,
What I observe would be different.
That's true. In the U.S., we tend to promote in organizations people to be direct and very assertive.
Okay.
In other cultures, for example, say an Asian culture, the expectation is to be more of a group, and so the tendency is to be more reserved. So people will get their needs met, but they tend to lean more towards the inquiry dimension.
Okay.
Not dimension, but that end of the spectrum. The same thing happens with emotions. For example, if we go to Europe and any of the Mediterranean cultures, we have stereotypes around people being very expressive and very passionate, where that would tend to skew people more towards the emotive side or above the line. You get into some of the Western European cultures, for example, I'd say Germany or Scandinavian countries, the tendency would be to express feelings less.
Okay.
But everyone does experience these 2 dimensions.
Okay. So it's universal. It just has to be put in context for what makes sense or how it would show up in your particular culture.
Exactly. And I would expect that the consultants who teach this program, being native to that culture, would be able to tailor and modify these descriptions. They could also use examples, especially with the multinationals and the international companies we deal with, how to explain some of the behavior when you're working with Americans or you're working with Europeans or Latin Americans.
Okay, so it's something just to be aware of.
Yeah. The caution would be not to get too involved in stereotypes, because we do have stereotypes of different cultures which are not necessarily accurate to the individuals.
Okay. Is there any better style?
There is no one style that's better than the rest. All the styles have behaviors and qualities that enhance. So ultimately, the best organization would be one that embodies and includes all 4 of these styles, because they do complement each other.
Okay. Good.